All right, I believe we are live on Facebook. So that's good stuff. Great. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead and press record. We'll get started right at 6:30, folks. Thanks for joining. Hello, everyone. I'm Kat Sheridan. I'm the director of the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery, and today I'm really pleased to share with you one of the artists from the exhibition Build It! Artist Creating Community in Ohio. Her name is Anissa Lewis, and she's in Cincinnati, Ohio. And I don't want to steal any thunder from her presentation, so I won't go on there, but I will give you a little bit of housekeeping. During the talk, if you have questions, please enter them into the chat for Zoom, and then in the comments in Facebook. We'll make sure to get to those at the end of the talk. And this exhibition was curated by Erica Hess. Super lucky to have these 12 folks in the gallery. And there's some really great virtual things that you can pop onto the OAC website and have a look at the 360 tour of it and like guide yourself through it. Anyhow, right now we're going to focus on Anissa. So Anissa, it is to you. And you are on mute.
Still on mute. Evening.
Hello.
Hello, can you hear me?
Can.
All right, wonderful. You would think that since mid-March of 2020, we would know how to work Zoom, but here we are. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. And Kat, one last bit of housekeeping. I'm keeping it to 45 to give time for Q&A at the end, correct?
That's perfect.
Sweet. All right. I just wanted to set my timer to keep me on track because I have a way of just, going on some tangents. All fun, but tangents nonetheless. So good evening and welcome, everybody. I am very grateful that you decided to spend this time with us to hear about the work, to hear about this story, this journey, because you could have been anywhere, but you chose to be here. So thank you so much. So let's hop right into the presentation. All right. As Kat mentioned, I currently live in Cincinnati, Ohio, but the story actually starts in Covington, Kentucky, which is just over the river, but that actually makes a world of difference when you think about it historically, when you hear about it in terms of a life cycle of a neighborhood, of a city, when you think about it in terms of underrepresented, marginalized peoples, people of color, class, accessibility, just all of the things that are threads that run through this story. There's a lot to pick apart. There's a lot to in which you can approach this work from any one of those various perspectives. And what I really, and another thing that I want to kind of like preface this entire talk is that for me, I very much wholeheartedly believe in that it's very much a conversation of, does a place make a people, or do people make a place? So if you kind of want to think about it in terms of like a nature versus nurture kind of a conversation, that is, very much at the center of my work. Does a place make a people, or do people make a place? And so for me, when I think about the way in which my neighborhood was set up, its history, how it came into being. First being a German neighborhood, and then, by the time that my grandparents and my parents came along, that it was a predominantly Black neighborhood. One neighborhood in now about 18 or 19 neighborhoods of all of Covington. And how that neighborhood was put together, its social fabric, has everything to do with how I am sitting here in front of you today. And uh, unbeknownst to me, of how it was put together, and then how I came about as a result. And then when I came back home to um, uh, later in the early 2000s to what I thought was going to be a sabbatical, uh, before I returned back to the East Coast. And what I found upon that return, um, pretty basically changed the trajectory of how I view myself, um, as a Black woman, as an artist, as someone who is very much connected to place. So those are kind of like the broad strokes. And as we go from body of work to body of work, hopefully each body of work that we're going to discuss teases out that conversation a bit more. Okay, so I know I started with the really heavy stuff, but hopefully as we go through the work, it'll kind of make itself clear as to how it all came together, or how I understand it, or why it's so important to me. And how the work came about as a result. So, like I said, born and raised in Covington, Kentucky, and my grandparents, my father's side of the family, Falmouth, Kentucky, um, family of farmers. My great grandfather was a preacher, so my grandmother was a preacher's daughter, and so we definitely have strong roots in Kentucky before moving to Covington, Kentucky. My maternal grandmother was from Selma, Alabama, before she relocated here to eventually marry my grandfather. Well, as other parts of my family ended up moving on to Chicago. Um, when my, how do I want to phrase this? My neighborhood, because it was marginalized, because of what it meant to be African American in this country, um, our neighborhood became one where everybody really relied on everybody else for support, uh, um, for solidarity, because everybody was going through the same thing. That you know, my father was the first to segregate the high school in Covington, Kentucky, um, and when you think about what it was like for African Americans in the 60s and 70s, and how what it meant for my father to be the first to integrate the high school, and what it was like um, for my parents to have that kind of a history, to have that kind of a journey. That is just representative of what the entire neighborhood was going through. Um, and um, because of everybody having to fight just to have access to education, access to employment, you can begin to see how this neighborhood was is very tightly knit, and that it wasn't just this family is going through this issue, that family is going through that issue. Very quickly, it became one community that was just one big family, and I hope that I'm kind of painting a fuller picture of that. So what that meant when my generation came along, my sister and my brother, like, when our generation came along, is that there wasn't that, one family's children was everybody's children. It wasn't as if, it wasn't as if everybody was left to their own, like, you'll figure it out, you know, um, that you had to only rely on the resources on your family and either you didn't or you didn't have it. Instead, it was generations of families raising children together. That it really was, that adage of it takes a village to raise the children, um, to raise a child. And so, I had several parents, if you will, that it wasn't just I was only responsible to my parents at home, but I was watched over everybody's, children was watched over by all the other parents in the neighborhood because we took care of each other. Um, and that was just something that was just understood because of understanding what it meant to get along, what it took to survive. Um, so, and I don't want it to sound so idyllic because obviously there were a lot of struggle, a lot of pain, a lot of things that we did not have because, at the end of the day, a lot of families were poor. It isn't as if East Side in Covington is this very affluent neighborhood. It wasn't, because of it being so disadvantaged and marginalized and not having access to things that were readily accessible to other neighborhoods in Covington. Everybody is relying on everybody else, that you have this very unique story of, everybody growing up and figuring it all out together. In the picture, I'm in the center. My little brother is in front of me. My eldest sister is the one in the blue tank top with the stripe, and these are just other children in the neighborhood that we were always around, always playing with, always staying over at each other's houses. Just thinking that that one neighborhood is your entire house. So when you're playing, like, everybody's playing at the playground, everybody is swimming at the swimming pool, everybody's riding bikes together. Um, you know, it's uh, um, it's just like I said, it's very communal, and I did not realize um, how crucial that was to my upbringing until I came back in the early 2000s. So hopefully, I'm kind of like laying down the backstory so that when we get to the work you'll see how loud um, the absence of things truly, truly were for me when I came home about 17 to 20 years later. Um, One last thing about growing up is that I did not realize like how how cared for and how much resources we did have. By the time that we were going through school, that there was so much at our schools in terms of educational programs and opportunities. Um, I was a part of a group that got to go to France for 3 weeks and have a sister school in France. That there were a lot of things, education wise, that were available for when I was going through high school that wasn't there when my parents were going to school. So, as I was growing up, Covington was actually experiencing really good economic times, even though it isn't affluent as a city, as a whole. There were a lot of wonderful things that were working, that were coming together for the benefit of its citizens. Okay. But what I want you to take away from this part of the story is the fact that by the time that me and my siblings were growing up in Covington, there were things that were there both in our neighborhood and in the city that were not there for my parents and my grandparents, um, and uh, made a world of difference for the generation that was coming through. So at this point, we're looking at the late 80s, early 90s. Okay. Really quickly, once I graduated from high school, I went to Galesburg, Illinois. Um, I went to Knox College and studied painting and drawing. I got a studio arts major. Um, when I went to college, I was first generation. My sister and I were first generation. So we were the first in our family to go to college. So much of what was happening allowed us to be able to have experiences that weren't that previous generations didn't have or did not have access to. That then allowed me to then um, to have just a lot of really, really wonderful experiences and opportunities. Going to the Vermont Studio Center, I got my MFA at Yale School of Art. Upon graduation from getting my MFA, I spent the summer in India with my best friend, and got to travel around the northern part of the northern part of India, for that entire summer after I graduated. After that summer, I moved to Philadelphia, and while in Philadelphia, that is where I worked in nonprofit, doing programming for. You cannot see that. um, Doing programming and working in neighborhoods of color. So working with high school students, doing a lot of community arts in terms of civic engagement, leadership, cultural, multicultural diversity, um, identity and voice. And so that work in Philadelphia for me was really important because it was my way of giving back, and being able to connect with a community in the same way that I had been poured into when I was growing up. And, looking back on it now, I did not realize how much that really played a role in how I view myself as an artist and what for me, would say is the role of being an artist. Um, Definitely hindsight is 2020. That uh, How I was raised, how what community meant to me, has such a huge role in how I view and approach my art. And that was just not something that I realized when I was going to college and when I was getting my master's. When you go to college, a completely different, or during that time period, a different definition of what it meant to be an artist was espoused. And so, no shade to, that kind of pedagogy, but I was realizing that that was just not the way in which um, being a maker and being a maker of things, being a culture maker, that just something just wasn't clicking for me. It wasn't about getting a gallery representation in New York, moving and trying to be a part of that circuit. There was just something just wasn't clicking for me, and I didn't have, the words for it, until I moved back home to Covington, and then be able to kind of like piece it all together as to why I made the decisions that I made to be in certain nonprofits, do certain projects, work with youth, work with, I was in Philadelphia, work with, uh, at the drug and alcohol unit at the county jail, to work with women on, in the county jail on, um, uh, self empowerment, um, storytelling, and voice, and to work with the medium of art in order to understand one's story and um, one's needs, one's voice. So I'm having all of these experiences. I'm I'm having access to all these opportunities, but not really piecing together, and understanding how they made me as an artist until I came back home. While I was in Philadelphia, the nonprofit that I worked with, which was going into elementary and middle school, and I was based in the high school, to work with children, um, around civic engagement issues. Well, my being the artist, I turn all of my programs into being arts based, and that was the way in which the high school students that I worked with would engage with all of these topics. Well, that nonprofit unfortunately sunsetted, and when it did, then I kind of like decided to kind of like take a pause and come back home to kind of regroup and figure out what was going to be my next step. Um, fully intending to move back to Philadelphia because that was such a pivotal place for me in terms of understanding what it means to be a person of color, and to be in a place where I'm not the only one. So much about my upbringing was about me being the only one in the room, and so there is a lot of pressure. There is a lot that you have to shoulder because you end up having to take on so much because you are the only one. Not to mention that survivor guilt becomes very real because, let's face it, at the end of the day, I'm not anybody special. I'm just like everybody else trying to figure it out, trying to make sure that that my screw ups aren't becoming so loud and so distracting. I'm just trying to figure it out just like everybody else. But when you are the only one in the room, it takes on a whole different beast. You don't have the luxury of screwing up and having it just be seen as nothing is just something totally that it has so much more weight, but that wasn't the case in Philadelphia. um, it was the first time where I actually had anonymity and where there were so many different ways of what it meant to be Black, what it meant to be African American. That was something that I had not experienced before. And so I was having my own renaissance, if you will, being in Philadelphia, being able to be around all these different ways of being Black and to really get to immerse myself in just all these different ways of being and thinking and approaching um, that I had not had the opportunity to do so before. So Philadelphia was just really, really crucial in my development as a woman, as a person of color, and as an artist because of all the things that were happening there during that time. So, of course, um, juxtaposing that with Covington, where that was not the case, where there are actually two foils, one of diversity and accessibility and all of these things to contrasting it with the neighborhood of underrepresented, marginalized, um, not being seen for the wonderful and the beauty and the love that is there. That was just not a place where I thought that I could be who I wanted to be. Um, you know, Even after the child that I had, is because you can't stay in East Side. There were no jobs there. Um, Home ownership was something that was so. It was this one particular block in the neighborhood that had the best Christmas decorations every year. um, but it was still just for a small few. Whereas in Philadelphia, it's a given. um, so those two cities in my mind, having such a crucial role in who I am, loom large in my mind. So I moved back home um, once the nonprofit sunsets, and this is what I am greeted with. Um, I am greeted with buildings that are dilapidated. I am greeted with buildings that are no longer there. And keep in mind, this is just a 20-year cycle. I'm old, but I ain't that old. Okay. I came back home when I was in my 30s. I had just turned 30. And this, what you're seeing, is what I pulled from Google Maps. And this is the view from across the street of the house that I grew up in. And as you can see, There's no family there. It's not even inhabitable. So the building on the left is the house directly across the street from one of the houses that I grew up in. The two images on the right is an open lot, and the side of the house that's about 2 lots up from the house that I grew up in. And this is just the top of the block. If you go to the other end of the block, you are greeted with 6 to 8 other open lots. So either there are buildings that are no longer inhabitable or buildings that are literally no longer there. And if we go back to my original premise, or what I am predicating this entire talk on, is that the place makes the people make the place. Clearly, there is a disconnect. Something has broken down, in that this place no longer serves its people. And if you are growing up in a neighborhood that is um, uh, underrepresented, disenfranchised, marginalized in the larger scheme of the entire town, then it cannot advocate for itself to ensure that its space serves them as a people. And when I think about the fact that this is where I am from, this is the place that made me. If I was to grow up in Covington now, who would I be? Again, other Google images. This is 2 blocks up, still Pleasant Street, but 2 blocks up. Now, the building that you're looking at, also screen grabs from Google Maps, this building no longer exists. This building was a convenience store where we would go and get candy and drinks and ice cream in the summertime. This building is gone. This building is no longer there. And so I had to sit and grapple with, here I'm thinking I'm coming home to just, chill at my parents' house, regroup, figure myself out, go back to Philadelphia. And I am compelled that's not in the cards. And that there are so many things that are happening, so many things that are not happening, that I just have so many questions of what happened while I was gone. When I was growing up, there were so many things that were there that were showing a turn of the tide, that it was no longer going to be the neighborhood or the town that my parents grew up in. That they were actually going to, Covington was on the path to have jobs, that the education system was actually sound and was, preparing young people to be able to have the resources and the means to be who they want and to live the life that they want. But in that short amount of time from when I left to when I came back, what happened? So I put together the Pleasant Street series to kind of bring awareness to what was happening. And so I photographed the houses that were on the street where I grew up, Pleasant Street, and of what they were like present day Covington. And then I went back and grabbed photographs from my upbringing and imposed them on the buildings to have this conversation of time, of voice and identity, of presence and absence. Because I, in my mind, know what I think and what I feel when I look at the buildings in my neighborhood. But if you were to walk down the street and see these buildings now, it's not going to come into your mind that, that there were strong families that lived here. There are strong stories that happened in these buildings. Instead, you're going to get a completely different story. And so there is this dissonance. There is this juxtaposition that is happening of what I know to be the truth and to know to be the case versus what reality is showing back at me. These two houses actually bookend Pleasant Street. So the building on the left is actually the building in the top right. That's the side of the building. And with this image of 1313 Garrett Street, this is the front of the building. The two gentlemen that you see are my father. The one house on the left is a picture of my father. He was a Marine and he served in the Vietnam War. And when he came back and when we were growing up, he was very active in Red Cross. And so he would drag us around to all of the Red Cross events where he would volunteer. And we would get to, participate and, watch, but also hang out in the first aid station while he would help volunteer at the events. This is the building that you see here, the one on the left. That building has now been torn down. It no longer exists. It's been demolished. And the images that I placed on the front of the building is my sister chasing after pigeons in downtown Cincinnati at Fountain Square. Anybody who's familiar with that part of Cincinnati, or that's where we went later in the day. The background is where we're in front of my on the street where my grandparents live, and then afterwards we went to Fountain Square and she chased the pigeons. But I just wanted, I was compelled that there needed to be a different story, a reckoning, a reconciliation of one time period with another time period. And incidentally, these works were done during the time of Covington's bicentennial. And so to know the history of our neighborhood, and yet this is where we are at the bicentennial of Covington, attention needed to be brought to it. So that was how the work got started. And it had other iterations, one of them being the love letter yard signs. So from doing that first body of work of walking just the 2 blocks of Pleasant Street, photographing the open lots and the uninhabitable buildings, kind of sparked in me that if this is just happening on just 1 2-block street of a neighborhood, then what's happening in the rest of the neighborhood, just it's 4 by 4 block radius. So I started at one end of East Side and then walked the outer perimeter and photographed all of the open lots that I saw as I did that walk around the neighborhood. And by the time that I had even made a full circuit back to where I started, but I had already photographed 21 open lots. And the volume of the absence of a tax base, of a family, of holes in a social fabric, of history, of story, of voice, it just became cacophonous. And it just begged the question, who is East Side now? So here is a screenshot from a Google map if you are looking at Covington, and that red square is the block that I walked. So I went north on Greenup, then I went west on 12th Street, down Wheeler, and then back around. And actually, I kind of zigzagged in a couple of streets to where I hung out, along streets that I used to play as a child, and just documented every open lot that I came across. And was met by nature reclaiming itself, which is a beauty in and of itself. But that's not the association that we have when we say an open lot. When we say open lot, we mean blight. We it's meant to represent all of the failings of a neighborhood. When we say open lot, we think crime, we think trash, we think people without, and all of the negative associations that come with it. But yet, if you were to break up that term and just say open, and then if I was to ask you to give every association that you have with the word open, you're not going to have the same negative associations that you have, right? When you think open, you think receptive, opportunity, possibility. You may even go so far and think dream. But yet, when it gets attached to the word lot, when it gets attached to place and a neighborhood and a town, something like physical, geographic, all of those positive associations just kind of go out the window, and you no longer get to associate that with a people, when that is the very associations that I have because of how I connect to this place. And so what I decided to do is that we needed to reclaim that word, that term. If there was ever going to be any kind of solution, any kind of path forward, any kind of reclamation, then we had to start with reclaiming that word, to know that we have the power, that it's not something that's happening to us, but it's something that we have an active hand in changing. So I also started to collect all of the signage that we have in our neighborhoods. Neighborhood crime watch, no parking, private property, anything and everything that we can think of how we navigate our spaces, especially our neighborhoods, our residential spaces. I started to collect, all of that signage. And so if you just go to Home Depot and you type in signs, it's a field day, absolute field day. And so what I did is that I took that signage and then I paired it with Black music, particularly neo soul. For those who are familiar, with neo soul, that is, just I love Black people, I love Black culture, and it's a music that is about affirmation, about love, about empowerment, all the feel goods, And so I took lyrics and paired them with that signage so that it was us giving permission to us that this is our space and that we need to make our space do and be what we need it to be in order to do and be, who we are and who we want it to be. I hope that makes sense. I can repeat that if you need me to. So I put together a series of signage, grabbing lyrics from Black music, grabbing signage from our neighborhoods, and then did that pairing. And from there, I, with a very dear friend at 5:00 in the morning on a Sunday when nobody was out, we went around to all of those open lots and placed that signage there. So that instead of it being how we say what we can and can't do in our spaces, that it instead turns it into a love letter, that these are the spaces that we need to love on so that these places can love on us. That you need to take care of the things that take care of you. And that if our spaces don't reflect who we are and who we want to be, then we're on a very vicious psychological trip that is going to get repetitive, and we're going to be telling very destructive and very harmful narratives to ourselves about who we are and what we can and can't do and who we can and can't be. And this trajectory needs to be corrected, needs to be righted. That this isn't, that this isn't, that this may be a part of our story now, but it doesn't have to always be that way. So from the 5 signs, I put them all over the neighborhood in the 20 to 21 open lots that I had photographed, and waited for the neighborhood to wake up that Sunday morning and respond. And Facebook was a poppin'. So I would get on, as I saw things coming in through Facebook, I would jump onto their page and say, hey, by the way, that's me. I wanted to, I placed that sign there. And this is why I did it. And then I would also grab the song that the lyric came from and post it on their page so that they would have not only the visual of, of that sign in that open lot, but also have the music, the soundtrack, if you will, to that space. Some of the signs did hold on for quite a bit, but I also was aware of the signs that were in lots that were owned by people who did not live in the neighborhood. And of course, those were the signs that came down the quickest, this being one of them. I did research who owned the property prior to putting prior to putting the signs there. This is an FYI, not that I wasn't going to not put the sign there. Of course, I'm going to put the sign there. But I at least wanted to be aware of who owns our property. And can I even say that? If it's owned by someone, can I say our? And that was something that was definitely triggered for me in this conversation or doing this body of work, of what it means to be an insider outsider, because I'm born and raised in East Side. And, if I go walking along the street in the neighborhood, all it takes is for someone to say to me, I know your grandmother, I know your father. And that is my connection. That is how I am known. And that is all that is needed to say that I am a child of this place. I belong here. But that was definitely something that was weighted on my mind, given the fact that I had moved away and I had been away for so long. Would I still be afforded that connection, given the fact that so much has happened while I was away? Would others still see me as being from this area, from that neighborhood, given the fact that I had moved away? And that I am looking back on a space that no longer exists, and that there are people who never left and went through this cycle of fat and lean, that the neighborhood was experiencing a time of upward or rise, but then something along the way happened to where there was this sharp decline. And so what I found in my research is that with the open lots, some of them were recently purchased by churches so that they could just be maintained, even though the church did not have the means in order to bring back a structure or have it become a revenue generator to bring, resources back into the neighborhood. There were quite a few that were owned by people who didn't even live in the state. There was even a greater amount of lots owned by the city. And so when you even think about the implications of that, that here the city owns this property, but yet there is no plan to do anything with it, which is only going to serve to continue to keep a neighborhood at a disadvantage. That it's something that's being perpetrated against its own citizens. I have a problem with that. And so between the time of the photo-based prints and the love letter yard signs, I was awarded a grant by the Center for Great Neighborhoods, located in Covington, to do a community engagement around this, around what is happening in the neighborhood. And so that led to interviewing residents, both long time and those who were like me, who grew up, who moved away, but were still connected, obviously, because family members were there. And so I was able to work with a videographer to record the stories. We recorded the stories in a Black parish, which was the only Black Catholic um, church in Covington. It is also the church that was where my grandparents and that generation got to go to school because of schools being segregated. So this church has a tremendous history in a tremendous role, a tremendous history in the neighborhood because of it being a place where it was the only Black Catholic church, and it was the only school for Black children during that time. I also I created murals at the local pool in our neighborhood. And I titled them, it was a total bite off of Cindy Chang's Before I Die murals. But I retitled them, I Feel Strong When, and My Neighborhood is Strong When. And so I placed them, at the park where we grew up, where there's the pool. You can have cookouts there. There's a playground, but that was another tremendous place in my upbringing, where that was our place to go and play, to learn how to swim, to just be kids. And so since that was a place that was integral to the neighborhood, it was very important to me to have the murals there, to have this public, anonymous but public conversation, so that as the mural was being interacted with and residents were writing down what was important to them, that then other residents could then see and could learn from one another how we feel strong, both as a person and as a neighborhood, so that then could start a community-wide conversation of how then do we continue to work in our space to make our space responsive to us. I also did other engagements with families who came to the park over the course of that summer. And then the signs got to travel. I did sandwich board signs of the same and got to travel them around. Because the demographic of the neighborhood had changed so much, it wasn't a given that that space was still viewed by recent residents as a space for them. So, but wanting this work to be inclusive, creating the sandwich signs that could then go around the city, go around the neighborhood, so that more voices could be a part of the conversation. And I think I'm at time.
So thank you for that.
Mm-hmm.
The backstory definitely supports the concepts and intention of your work. So folks, if you have any questions that you want to pose to Anissa, we do have just about 10 minutes that we can get through some questions. I'm curious, now that your work is, if you'd like to stop sharing, then we can
Mm-hmm.
just chat with each other.
Sure.
Yeah. And anybody that has any questions, go ahead and put them into the comments. I, I, I love that you talked about this experience was kind of, it brought to the fore ideas that were latent, that were
Mm-hmm.
nascent in you and waiting to be developed, and that the pedagogy that you went through in your BFA and in grad school had a particular viewpoint that, of course, clearly you had the skill, ability, and mindset to get through that and have that as your focus, but it didn't gel for your concepts that were waiting for you. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious, I know that you're a teacher. When you think about how you can pull out the very best of each individual
Mm-hmm.
and thinking about the work that you do and how you're doing that and building community through that social practice, can you articulate that in the pedagogy you deliver?
Oh, okay. That's not where I was expecting you to go with that question.
I know, I'm so sorry.
I was all set up, and then you did turn to left. I'm like, it's
You're
an
allowed to
awesome
take the turn
question.
you'd like. You
No,
take
no,
the turn
no.
you'd like.
Because that's a great question, because I think that's why I am a teacher. Um, I, to be honest, because I don't separate it. And it took me a really long time to realize that connection and being in conversation with individuals, young individuals, about um, paying attention to what they pay attention to, because that is so crucial in terms of them understanding their identity, their voice, their values, and how they view themselves contributing and stepping into the conversation. Um, it all stems from that. And I never really put it together until I started doing this work, that was what was so important to me in my artistic practice, is that it was something that was about having conversations, that storytelling, that voice, because voice is connected to power. And it's how you show up. It's how people, um, view themselves as having any kind of impact, or things that are fulfilling and meaningful. It's about how you contribute and wanting to be seen and valued in the way that you contribute. That's so huge, because that was really poured into me. Like, when I was growing up in the East Side, I never fit in. I never made sense there. But I never doubted for one moment that I was loved and that I was cared for. And that, even though I may not fit in, that doesn't mean that I didn't belong. And I don't know how to make sense of that or how to explain that any better. But I always knew that because I was poured into, it was crucial that then I give back. And so that is just such an integral part of why I do the projects that I do, why I make the work that I make, why I speak on the things that are important to me, because it is about community. It is about, I so much believe in that if I eat, we all eat, that is how we survive, and how, not even survive, but how we thrive and succeed as a people, is because we are connected. We're not meant to be alone. We're not meant to be separate. And so it only makes sense that I would be an instructor, and that would be a part of the way in which I help younger artists make sense of themselves and their work. Because it's about, well, how are you How are you contributing to the conversation? Where are you stepping in? You know, where are you giving value and giving, where are you giving value? Because that is so intrinsic as to why you make. I mean, that's what I think. That's what I believe.
We have a comment from a viewer,
Mhm.
from Kimberly. Kimberly said, I used to live in Long Beach, California, also Galveston, Texas, and I've seen so many homes falling in and so many empty lots. And I've always thought of what was there and the lives that were lived in those homes. Your story and what you're doing is beautiful, and
Thank
showing
you, Kimberly.
people and putting it in their faces what is truly happening is this in these neighborhoods, pure beauty. And then we have a question from Amy, who says, I personally felt such a strong sense of love for people and for the spaces connected to them. In all of the work, there's a real light and freshness to it. Can you share how you're able to talk about such heaviness and trauma in a way that feels hopeful, responsible, and joyous?
Whoa. Well, thank you. Thank you. I think that, I think maybe because it's a story of resilience and the story isn't over, um, I think that if anything, it's a testament to how much we were connected as a community growing up. And then that was just the way in which, um, that was just the way in which everybody survived. Um, and that's where you want to, that's where you put the focus on. Because, you know, life is hard. Life is really hard. But that doesn't have to be what you focus on. I think that, you know, because when you're presented with a challenge, you know, it's just part of the human condition to rise to it. And I think that that's, you know, why, why I'm able to make the work that I made, because even though those houses are the way that they are, and even though those houses no longer exist, um, it's a memorial. Um, it's acknowledging that they were there and that they provided so much, and that we were able to be a family, a communal family, because of those spaces. And so maybe that's what it has to. Maybe that's why. Um, yeah, I mean, I think it just goes back to what I was saying before. Does the place make the people, or does the people make the place? You know, it's a great
And what do
question.
you believe?
Oh, see, that's why you're an artist, because you just pose the questions. You don't answer them. You just pose them. We have conversations about them. Um, it gets so complicated because, like, when I think about how the spaces that we show no love for, but then want to turn around and gentrify them and act like that they're the, you know, that now they have value because we you know, we brought them back, you know, online. They're no longer dark spaces, that now they have value because of, you know, because of what the resources that were poured into them now, without even speaking to the people who endured all the time, before others decided that they wanted to value the place. It makes it very difficult to it makes it a difficult conversation to have when I think about the way in which we treat our spaces and places, and that we'll pour into them before we'll ever pour into the people who live in them. Um, it just, you know, it's a very frustrating conversation,
Yeah.
um, because it's interdependent. You know, you can't really focus on one, because one is able to be because of the other, but yet in our society we've figured out a way to justify skewing it and just focus on the place.
Mm.
because a different group wants to value it, but not value the people who were already connected to it.
So Anissa, what I'm hearing you say is that they should never be mutually exclusive.
I think that where we are now, I think that, and when I think about the East Side specifically, I will say that it's the people. Yeah, it's the people. It has to start with the people, because a space needs to be able to serve and to provide for the needs of the people. And I'm being, and because my work is site specific, in this instance, it has to lead with the people.
Yeah.
Yeah. But if we're going to have the conversation on a larger level, that's when it gets complicated.
Yeah.
And I think unnecessarily so.
I love that your work really kind of pulls the strings of that. Like you're teasing it out and asking people to, without people recognizing, you're making people curious. Like whether it's in the Pleasant Street series where superimposing the images, like it's the same thing that happens when you erase a word on a sheet of paper. Everybody wants to see what that word is.
Right.
You're just digging into it. Oh, I think we have a comment from it. Rebecca said, "Thank you for sharing this deep look into your work. You gave me so much to think about and questions the way I view such neighborhoods and dramatic transitions." So there's that. And yeah, it is 7:30. I thank you so much. I agree with Rebecca that the deepness and richness of that story to support the works is quite valuable. And what a celebration of Women's History Month to have you sharing and going deep in that way for us, and being part of this exhibition. So
my pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you so much, Anissa. Thank you everyone who joined us this evening. I hope you enjoyed the talk. We do have additional virtual content that you are welcome to have a look at, both on the website, on our Facebook, and some to come up. We have a couple more artist talks. I think we have Cal Cullen coming up here.
Yes.
On March 31st. We have Liz Moggins on March 17th, and a couple of workshops. So thank you to the governor's office and legislature who supports the Ohio Arts Council and allows space like the Ohio Arts Council's Rife Gallery to exist and amplify voices like Anissa Lewis. Thanks everyone. Have a great night.
Thank you everybody for coming out. Thank you.